Welcome back. I was roasting a chicken for dinner last night, and I like to place some thick slices of onion underneath to keep it off the bottom of my Dutch oven. But when I went to get an onion from the bag, I noticed something interesting. 3 of them have decided that it's time to sprout and grow these wonderful green and white shoots. And that got me thinking, are these really that much different from store-bought green onions? Can I use these sprouted onions to grow more onions? And why haven't you pressed the like button yet? We both know you're going to enjoy this one. Let's start with, can I use these onions to grow more onions? And the answer is, sort of. Onions are a biennial plant, meaning that their full growth cycle takes 2 years instead of just 1. If I were to bury these onions and plant them, they would die because I'm not a very good gardener. But if someone who knew their ass from a hole in the ground tried, they would continue to grow these green shoots until some really cool looking flowers came up. Seriously, Google image search onion flowers and tell me those don't look crazy. Anyway, eventually the flower would mature and turn to seed, and next year those seeds would grow new onions. Realistically, if you're trying to grow onions, especially for the first time, you should probably look into something called onion sets. They're basically a small, immature onion bulb that's still in its first year of growth. They're grown from seed and then harvested before they've had a chance to fully mature. Planting sets instead of seeds will drastically reduce the time that it takes the bulb to grow to a usable size, since they're already part of the way through their first seed to onion growth phase. Let me know in the comments if you're interested in seeing a little gardening content pop up on the channel. Otherwise, I'll just keep it to cooking. Anyway, that brings us to the second question. Can you use these the same way you would use green onions? And the answer seems to be yes. I'll be honest, I almost never use green onion in dishes. As you already know, I'm not a huge fan of chunks of onion in my food. I do like the flavor though. With that in mind, I'd like to extract as much flavor from these as possible, so I've decided to fry them in oil with one of the onions to try making scallion oil, or green onion oil. I learned a lot making this video, but one thing that really surprised me was learning that scallions and green onions are the exact same thing. It just depends what the grocery stores label them as. Scallion oil sounds better than green onion oil to me, so that's what I'm going to call it moving forward. Traditionally, scallion oil is used a lot in Chinese cooking, and it's considered a mother sauce. This means that it can be used as a base to make a lot of subsidiary or daughter sauces. For today, I'll be keeping the recipe to just what you can see here, onions and oil. You can add soy sauce, sugar, ginger, dried chilies, or whatever other aromatics you'd like. But as this is the first time I've made scallion oil, I feel like I need to know what it tastes like on its own, so that I know what other flavors might complement it, instead of just overshadowing it with a whole bunch of garlic and chili. To prepare these green onions, I'm just chopping them off the bulb, removing any dried brown bits or anything that looks like I wouldn't really want to eat it, then chopping them up the same way I would a store-bought green onion. Some of them do have a layer of onion skin on the, I guess you would call it a stem, but it peels off easily. You should probably wash these before chopping and using them, but frankly, I forgot to. And they're going to get cooked in boiling oil anyway, so I'm not too worried. If you do wash them first, be sure to dry them completely, as any extra water that you add to your oil might spit or splatter as things heat up. I'm also including one of the 3 onions in my oil just to make sure I don't end up with an end product with a weak flavor. If you have more green onions, you could leave the extra onion bulb out, but these are the only onions that had started growing, so this is what I have to work with. Just to really drive home that these are no different from store-bought green onions, have a look at them chopped up. If you were cooking and I handed this to you, would you know that it came from a few onions that grew in my pantry by accident? I sure wouldn't. I'm adding all of my onions to a cold cast iron pan, then adding enough oil to cover them. I'm using canola oil, which I'm sure some of you have some opinions about, so you can use whatever neutral oil you prefer. I like starting with a cold pan while I'm using this much oil for a few reasons, but mostly just to avoid any water in or on the food from superheating into steam and either making a mess or causing me to get burned. Starting with the oil at room temperature also allows me to make sure I don't overheat and burn the green onions, which would make everything bitter and gross. I weighed the amount of oil I added just out of curiosity, as I wasn't really sure how much would fit in my pan, and it came out to about 250 grams, or just a little over 1 cup. This should be enough for a couple different recipes I have in mind, so let's get to it. I'm using a cast iron pan on a cast iron element, and with that much thermal mass, it does take a while for everything to heat up. But once it's hot, this setup is fantastic for maintaining a constant temperature. I'm looking to hold things around 220 degrees Fahrenheit without going too far past that, and I want to keep this cooking for long enough to drive out as much water from the onions as is reasonably possible. From what I learned researching this video, you could cook this for 2 or 3 minutes to get a more delicate flavor, but if you want to be able to store it in the fridge for a longer period of time, you should cook as much of the water out of the onions as possible in order to prevent spoiling or water-based foodborne illnesses like listeria. You can see that I went a few degrees past 220 and I had to make a couple of adjustments, but once I had the temperature dialed in, it was just a matter of patience. Looking back at the footage, I let this cook for 12 minutes once it came up to temperature, but at the time I just kind of eyeballed it. I used a fork to make sure nothing was burning to the bottom or turning dark brown. I then turned the element off and let it sit to cool for about 30 minutes. When I checked the temperature, it was still 160 degrees Fahrenheit, so I left it on a trivet to cool a little further. Years ago, when I was first learning how to make and store homemade jams and jellies, I didn't understand what thermal shock was, and I poured boiling grape jelly into a glass jar, causing it to immediately shatter. Ever since then, I've been very careful about pouring hot liquids into glass jars, which is why I let this cool down to around 100 degrees Fahrenheit before trying to store it. This also worked out in my favor since I had some, problems pouring the oil into the jar. I'll just let the footage speak for itself here. Release some of it. I don't know what the best option is here. I'm sure this isn't it, but I'm going to put paper towel on the floor and carefully scoop this off of the edge. And you might as well watch since I've already screwed this up. Okay, so far so good. Crap, split the streams. You know, all things considered, that didn't go that bad. It's been my experience in making onion mayonnaise that leaving it in the fridge for a couple of days can really enhance the flavor. So I left this oil in my fridge for 3 days to mellow out, and this is how it looks. The white onions have mostly settled to the bottom, and the green onion is floating suspended in the oil, which has become slightly cloudy. As long as you've cooked this long enough to drive off any water present in the onions, this should keep in the fridge for quite a while. I would assume at least a few weeks to maybe a month or two. But the wonderful thing about fats and oils is that they'll tell you very clearly when they've gone off by their smell. Rancid fat is a smell that you only have to experience once to fully understand. It's similar to smelling spoiled milk in the sense that as soon as it hits your nose, you're going to immediately lose your appetite and want to get it as far away from you as possible. I'm saving most of this oil for a future video, and of course the one time I take a few precautions when pouring is the one time I don't spill any. Ah well. As for today, I'd like to try making something called Scallion Oil Noodles. And to fit the theme of the video, I found some ramen-style noodles in my cupboard that I bought at least 2 years ago and forgot about. They're about 15 months past their expiry date, but looking at the ingredients, nothing really worries me too much aside from maybe the dried egg yolk. They don't have any concerning smells, and there's no visible mold present, but at the same time, I strongly suggest you do not eat food that's this far past its expiry. Just another case of do as I say, not as I do. They cooked and tasted fine, and I didn't experience any issues after eating them, but I do plan on using these up within a few days of opening the package and throwing out any that are left over at that point. My health is more important to me than a half a package of expired noodles, but for the sake of getting through the video, I'll take my chances. Once the noodles were cooked, I added what I thought was a good amount of scallion oil to my pan, heated it up, and then considered whether I should put all the noodles in at once or do 2 batches. Hindsight is 20/20, and I absolutely should have either done 2 batches or used a larger pan. I also feel like I could have had the pan a bit hotter before the noodles went in, but I was worried that if I fried them in the oil, they would become hard or chewy. After tossing the noodles in hot oil for a few minutes, I transferred them to a bowl to see how they taste, and honestly, I'm not blown away, but I didn't expect to be. Needs other things, but that's pretty damn good as a base. The scallion oil itself is absolutely delicious. The only way I can describe it is it's like the best flavors of an onion ring in liquid form. This has me very excited to try it in other dishes, but as the singular flavor in a bowl of noodles, it was quite underwhelming. I now understand why scallion oil is considered a mother sauce, because with a little acid, a little heat, and maybe a little salt added, this would be absolutely delicious. Off camera, I added a little sriracha and a lot of salt to my noodles, and to paraphrase Babish, this entered the clean bowl club without hesitation. If I were to make this oil again, and I probably will, I would add a big pinch of crushed red pepper flakes, a splash of soy sauce, and a little fresh black pepper before turning on the heat, then add some garlic towards the end to make sure that doesn't burn and turn bitter. In fairness though, would you call that scallion oil, or would you call that chili garlic oil? I'd just call it delicious. If you're interested in seeing what I did with the rest of my homemade scallion oil, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next video. See you next time.